Thank you, Peter. Good evening, companions. I noticed that one or two of you are here in collar and tie, and you look very smart, and I'm very impressed, and you're putting the rest of us to shame. But the dress code is casual, but I do apologise. Perhaps we should have made that a bit more widely known, because I did have one or two ring me prior to this presentation to ask that question. Welcome everybody to the latest in our provincial speaker series. I'm delighted that so many of you are here present. I think we've got 90 registered for this presentation this evening, which is probably a record for one of these Zoom presentations, and is a measure of just how much interest it has generated. And of course, this evening, the presentation will have somewhat of an international flavour, and we will be hearing about the Royal Arch in America, a Californian perspective, and I will be delighted to welcome excellent companion Michael Ramos, who by the miracles of technology will be joining us from California, where I think it must be about 9:30 in the morning. So welcome, Mike. Before I hand over to you though, Mike, I'll just say a few words of introduction. One or two of you may already know Mike. You're happy with Mike, are you?
Mike is perfect.
Yeah, thank you. So in addition to his craft involvement in California, he's a very active and distinguished craft mason in California. Excellent companion Mike is a past first principal of the Siminoff Daylight chapter number 163, and the founding officer of the Atlas chapter, both of which I believe meet at Union City in California. He's a life member of the Golden State chapter of research, and he serves the Grand Chapter of California as inspector of its 15th district. Now, excellent companion Mike has many strings to his Masonic bow, and I did do a little bit of research online and searched his name online, and found an item on him on the web page for the California Freemason, where it's described as an international man of masonry. And he is, of course, a Mason on 2 different continents. And in addition to his Masonic involvement in California, he is a member of the Lodge of Merit, which I believe meets at Great Queen Street. And he's also a founding member of the Cornerstone Lodge here in Essex. So he is one of us. He's an Essex Mason. And I was very pleased to learn very recently that he may well be increasing his Masonic interest in Essex, because he hopes to become a joining member of the Shoebury chapter. And I shall very much look forward to welcoming him into the Royal Arch Province of Essex at some time in the future. So, in addition to his other Masonic distinctions, in his daytime job, Mike is the Lodge Development Manager for the Grand Lodge of California. He also co-produces an online Masonic speaker series, and is a very accomplished Masonic speaker himself. We're very lucky and we're very privileged to have him with us here this evening. And he is going to talk to us about the Royal Arch in America. And without too much further ado, Mike, I will hand over to you.
Thank you greatly, sir, for that gracious introduction. I really appreciate it. Companions, thank you all for being here in attendance. As you heard, my name is Mike Ramos, and I'm very, very pleased and humbled that I was invited to come present to you on the Royal Arch in America, most specifically in California. And as with all international visits, even though this is obviously in a very different format than what we would typically assume, I would like to extend fraternal greetings from the Grand High Priest of the Grand Chapter of California, Most Excellent Dick Bullard, as well as the Grand Master of Masons of the Grand Lodge of California, Arthur H. Weiss. They're both aware of this presentation, send sincere personal greetings, and hope that in the future their schedules will permit where they actually can join us for an online event, perhaps, or maybe even in person after the pandemic subsides. I'm obviously very pleased and was very humbled to be asked to come and to come and present. And I just wanted to make mention, obviously, that I'm honored to see the Royal Arch Executive with us on this call today. Thank you, sirs, for your attendance. And I would also like to quickly thank the communications team that worked very hard on behalf of this presentation to make sure that it flowed as smoothly as possible. So before I bring up my deck and share my screen, I do just want to say that I am going to be presenting to you, obviously, on the Holy Royal Arch, specific mostly to California and America. But with that, I need to make it clear that I'm here speaking for myself. I do not want to be perceived as the official mouthpiece of the General Grand Chapter or the Grand Chapter or the Grand Lodge, et cetera, et cetera. So I just want to make sure that that's known. I'm going to be sharing with you my own personal experiences, my own personal research, my own personal findings. So I'm also going to be lightly touching on certain elements which involve ritual. However, I will not be discussing any of what might be called the secrets or modes of recognitions, words, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to be talking on some things which we can speak about openly, because this is not a tiled meeting, albeit I know that there's only companions present, but I do want to refrain from going too far beyond what would be considered appropriate. So anyways, I'm going to now set up to share my screen and pull up my deck. I would like to know, can everybody see my screen right now? I'll be opening this up. Thank you very much. Okay. So with that, let me just shrink this down. Thank you. Okay. As it's been said many times before, here to present on the Holy Royal Arch in America, California perspective. Mike Ramos, I am the inspector of the 15th District for the Grand Chapter of California, and also serve on the Education Committee for the Grand Chapter of California. You've already heard my introduction, so there's no reason to go into any of that. And although I do know that I'm using some images which would be better viewed much closer, I found this image very pertinent, as typically in my presentations, this would be where I kind of give you some background. However, in this one here, this is an image representative of the Royal Arch, and particularly the Royal Arch as it's worked in America. Obviously, Masonry is full of symbols, and this one especially, as you can imagine, leading up to the principal sitting at the principal sitting in the rear of this depiction here. You see other companions, which are symbolic of a portion of the ritual which we have maintained in California, which is the passing of the veils, which I will lightly touch on. But I do find Royal Arch imagery to be some of the richest in symbolism that we can find within the craft. So what I'm going to start by sharing with you is within Royal Arch Freemasonry in America, with each one of the degrees, which is something different than in England that the chapter confers, you actually receive what's called a pre-lecture. So the candidate for the degree would receive this in the anteroom, or candidates for the degrees would receive this in the anteroom. And I'm sharing a little slice of the Royal Arch pre-lecture as presented in California. My brother, on this occasion, we have the privilege of conferring, and you have the privilege of receiving the crowning degree of Masonry, that of the Royal Arch. As you go along as a sojourner in this degree, we may urge your closest attention to its significant symbols, which will guide us to our greatest objective, the long-lost Master's Word. Now, I'm going to break this presentation out into sections, and I promise not to hang too long on any one section, because I want to make sure that we can keep this presentation moving, as well as have time for Q&A and a bit of a discussion at the end. So I'm going to start with a brief history of the Royal Arch in America. Secondly, I'm going to move into the current governance of the Royal Arch in America. Then I'm going to speak about chapters in California, the workings of an American chapter, something called the York Rite, which we will get to, and I'm going to explain a bit about that. Some differences of the composition between an American and an English chapter of Royal Arch Masons. I want to talk about some unique aspects to California and or American Royal Arch Masonry, talk a bit about customs and culture, share some fun images of regalia, talk about philanthropic endeavors, our plans for the future of the Royal Arch, and then a conclusion with Q&A. So a brief history of the Royal Arch in America. The Royal Arch is nothing new to America. It has certainly been here since the days of the colonies, and some of the earliest known recorded Royal Arch ceremonies come from the American colonies. Now, this usually gets misconstrued, and I've had people say, are you trying to tell me the Royal Arch comes from America? No, it doesn't. But what I am trying to say is that early on in any degree's life, you can find various names, various terms. There's no standardization at the very onset of any degree, right, etc. But what we do find is some of the earliest recorded Royal Arch ceremonies are coming out of the colonies. These were being worked in Royal Arch lodges, which was a term very popular prior to what we now today would certainly call chapters. These were under ancient warrants, so these would have been primarily military groups that had traveling charters, traveling warrants, as you'd be more familiar with the term, coming out of the Ancients Grand Lodge, Irish, Scots, and English, that allowed them to spread masonry throughout the colonies and, to be frank, very successfully throughout the world. And these were operating in such places in America as Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere. In addition to the Royal Arch, you also had some of these lodges working other degrees and other orders, such as variations of the mark, some degrees that eventually would pan out to fall under Royal Select Masters, some that fall under Knights Templar, Malta, etc., as well as degrees that are now associated with the Allied Masonic degrees and the appendant orders attached to the Red Cross of Constantine. So I want it to be known that in addition to the Royal Arch, there was a lot of early side degrees, quote unquote, high degrees being worked here in the colonies. The feud, which I'm sure everyone here is extremely familiar with, the feud that occurred between the Premier Grand Lodge, founded in 1717 or 1721, however you wish to determine that date, and then in addition, the Ancient Grand Lodge, coming about in 1751 to 1756, they had obviously a very strong rivalry, a very strong feud. This feud actually did not really play a big hampering on the developing strain of American Freemasonry. Yes, there were provincial Grand Lodges here in the colonies. Some were of the Premier, some were of the Ancients, some were of rival, even unknown Grand Lodges, et cetera, but honestly, that did not really affect our Masonry too much. However, I will go deeper into how ultimately, with as many things, the ancients won out in a lot of regards, but we'll get to that later. As still proves the same today, the chapter is one of the most popular progressive orders beyond the Craft Lodge. So, current governance in America. Founded in 1797, we have the General Grand Chapter of Royal Arch Masons International. This functions much more as an administrative body, one that aids in helping, let's say, maintain regularity, operating and fostering charities. It's a very positive guidance council. So this would be considered, let's say, more or less the grand body in the United States that most of the state grand chapters find themselves under the auspices of. Not all, but most. Coming down from that tier, then you have the grand chapter of the state. For an example, the Most Excellent Grand Chapter of California was established in 1854. And then under that, you additionally then find private, or what we would call subordinate chapters. So that's the current scale of governance on how this operates here in the States. A little bit more. Each state's grand chapter is sovereign to some extent. And what I mean by this, and I lightly touched upon in the previous slide, is that each state's grand chapter does not have to align themselves with the general grand chapter. They certainly can go about it on their own. As with most things in Masonry, especially the craft, there is no united Grand Lodge of the Americas or the United States of America. Each state is sovereign. This is the case with the majority of Masonic bodies, although some align themselves to a general grand chapter or a general grand encampment or council, etc., which performs different functions. But for argument's sake, each grand chapter has the ability to be truly sovereign. The majority of our grand officers serve 1 year, except for the grand secretary or grand recorder, something to that equivalent, grand treasurer, lecturers, or organists. Beyond that, the majority of our grand officers serve 1 year, and that is in the form of a portion of a grand body being progressive. So once you are elected to a certain stage in this grand body, it is most likely that you will continue to progress year after year until you reach the head, and then you will serve your year, and then you will be out. However, some, like the secretary, recorder, treasurer, lecturers, organists, stay much longer usually. We do not operate within a provincial structure. Now, every state is different. So I want to talk about how California operates this. We utilize divisions and districts. In chapter, that's what we're here talking about. For an example, we would have a district grand officer who then has appointed inspectors, which I'm one of those, who then reports to him. Each of these inspectors has a district that they work with, which makes up a district is a number of chapters, who they work with and aid in such things as ritual proficiency, administrative duties. Overall, they really should serve as a friend to the chapter and be able to provide them with support, potential guidance, and be there for them. That's ultimately what our role should be. We then report up to the district grand officer, who then reports up to the head of the grand body in one way or another. We do not have past grand rank, except for past first grand principals. We'll get to some title differences, with only other certain allowances made per jurisdiction and office, i.e. for certain officers who might hold a office for a certain amount of time, dependent on the order, they might be entitled to a past grand rank, or some that might be in the progressive grand line and are due to go up to the head of that body, but due to illness or due to some other acceptable situation have to bow out. They might also retain a form of past grand rank. And this varies from order to order. But I bring this up so that you have a bit of a taste of how our grand structure operates, and also how our honor system operates. Each body has its own set of honors, which might be very direct. High priest of the year, secretary of the year, et cetera, et cetera. In the craft, you have the Hiram Award, and that is much more at the chapter level. There are some lifetime achievement awards, which are granted per grand body, but that changes from order to order. So either in our system, if you are the, let's just say, the Grand Principal Sojourner, you either are that in an active sense or you aren't. There is no past title to be obtained. So digging now into private or subordinate chapters within California, currently there are 50 chapters located throughout the state, and we have roughly 345 lodges. I can tell you that number is going to jump because I know of at least 10 new lodges, which will shortly be warranted within the next year and a half. The average age of a companion is 60 years. The average chapter is made up of 45 companions. The oldest chapter in the state is California chapter number 1, which is located in San Francisco. And the youngest or newest chapter in the state, Atlas chapter under dispensation, is also operating out of San Francisco. We have one research chapter, the Golden State Research Chapter, which does not confer the degrees, but its purpose is to serve as a research body. And we also have what's called the Grand High Priest Chapter. This is a holding chapter that does not convene, but temporarily serves those unattached companions who are currently seeking to join a new chapter. Perhaps their chapter has surrendered its charter, its warrant, or perhaps they decided to leave, but they just haven't figured out a new home yet. They would temporarily fall into this structure. So now onto some more interesting things. The workings of an American chapter. So an American Royal Arch chapter works 4 degrees. The first degree you receive when you join a Royal Arch chapter is that of Mark Master. The next is, it's called a degree. I prefer to call it a ceremony, and I will explain a little bit about this. This is called the Virtual Past Master. What does this mean? Why do we have it? So, as I was talking about earlier, ancients versus the moderns. The ancients are responsible for formalizing Masonic installation ceremonies at a time when the Premier Grand Lodge more or less would just decree people are installed. They formalized ceremonies, especially that for an installed master, which I'm sure many of you on this call are familiar with. So one of the areas where the moderns kind of won out in the American system was this concept that authority is not granted necessarily from master to master, but from a grandmaster and then down accordingly. So what that means is that in American Freemasonry as a whole, you do not find lodges when they operate installations having the installed master ceremony. It did not become part of the lodge culture in the way that it obviously strongly is in England and elsewhere. So there's two ways of going about this. One thing within at least California, and I know through other states, we have what are called masters and past masters associations, which is where newly installed masters join and they end up receiving this ceremony through these associations. And another thing that was determined early on was that some form of recognizing the fact that only past masters at a certain time in Masonic history were allowed to join a Royal Arch chapter had to be made known within chapters in America. That decision came down during the formation of something called the York Rite that I'll talk about later. So the virtual past master is this calling back ceremony to the working of an installed master's board. And it is virtually conferred in the sense that you show up, you receive it. However, you are not a past master after you receive it. It is simply a, let's call it a historic callback to that prerequisite in order to then advance. Moving forward from that, the next degree is Most Excellent Master, which this term, the name can be confusing because when you go to different places, different countries especially, there is a degree called Most Excellent Master or Excellent Master, and it could be something different. In America, via a slight innovation, it became a ceremony which shows you what occurs with that keystone created in the Mark Master degree and how it was integral in the completion of Solomon's Temple. The next degree after that is the Holy Royal Arch. Within this degree, and we'll get to some differences, but the veil ceremony, as I mentioned, is part of it, which I know in some jurisdictions would call that the veil ceremony, the Most Excellent Master or Excellent Master. For us, it is part of the Holy Royal Arch, a very august degree. And this body, the chapter in America, is termed the capitular degrees or capitular masonry. And that means that it's in relation to a cathedral and or a subset of men separated for the purpose of ecclesiastical or holy work. So you can imagine that, I'm sure, very clearly. And it is also the first progressive order beyond the craft, making part of the York Rite, or better put, honestly, the American Rite, which was formalized in roughly 1797. So what does this mean? What is a York Rite? I'm going to give you my thought on this, and this is where it's very clear that I'm speaking for myself. So the York Rite, in reality, is was an invention of some early American Masons, particularly Thomas Smith Webb, in weaving a Mason's journey from that of entered apprentice to stop at the Order of the Temple within Knights Templar degrees. Now, that sounds odd, and it is. However, when you consider other rites, such as the ancient accepted rite, the Swedish Rite of Masons, the rectified Scottish Rite, and the list goes on, they tend to end at the period of the Crusades. So this wasn't really this American anomaly. It really was part of rites that were being developed even prior. However, why I say this is a bit of a marketing scheme that kind of went off the rails is because usually a rite is operated by one sole entity. It is operated by a Supreme Council. It is operated by a grand chapter or a grand lodge, depending on where you are in the world. These are operated by separate grand bodies. The Grand Lodge is obviously on its own. The Grand Chapter, the Grand Council of Royal and Select Masters, and what we call the Grand Commandery of Knights Templar, Knights of Malta, etc. However, this process, the term stuck. Do people consider it an actual right in America? No, not really. I think that people are very well informed of how this terminology came about, but what we do is we do utilize the term a lot without giving it the same connotation, because in America, you really have two ways of progressing after you've been made a Master Mason. If you wish to progress, most Masons go to the chapter, and if they wish to carry that out, by being now a Royal Arch Mason, they are also eligible to join a council of Royal and Select Masters. And this is California specific because some states operate slightly differently. But then after you've been made a Royal and Select Master, you now are eligible to join Knights Templar Masonry if you wish. The other avenue you can pursue is that of the Scottish Rite. And this is where it gets a bit different, because unlike the ancient and accepted rite for England and Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and different countries, the American Scottish Rite did not, it changed its ways a bit early on, and it admits you do not have to profess a certain religion to join it. So it's open to everyone. So there is a bit of taking this path as well as taking this path, which most Masons do. So they have a very well-rounded image of American Masonry. But just to explain how this ties itself in as potentially, in some Masons' eyes, the first step on a journey. For me, speaking personally, ancient craft masonry exists of the degrees we know that it does. The Royal Arch, capping that off, and anything else that you do is up to you and up to your own personal interests. So an American versus English chapter composition. So what I've done here is that I've shown you an old image of a version of setting up for the Royal Arch degree in America. You can see the veils there. See some familiar people, but also what I wanted to do was show you that the officers are slightly different. So you know the composition of an English chapter, so let's focus a bit on American. The first principle in an American chapter is J. The second principle is Z. The third principle is H. Why? Well, to be honest, I have spoken to very learned Masonic scholars about this and people that know much more about ritual than myself. And they said there is no moment where we see that key turned to where our principles order became different than in England. But the story, the Masonic tradition, if you like, informs us that that when Royal Arch Masonry was being formalized in America, even then they couldn't tolerate a king being over them in chapter. So they intentionally altered the offices to make the primary officer that of the high priest. It's a nice story. I don't know how much truth is there to it, but it creates a good laugh when we do this in person. As you go down the list, you can see that some of the titles are different, and I'm not claiming that these are all interchangeable. Clearly, a chaplain is not interchangeable with a treasurer, but I tried to do this, I did do this in an order of ascension from quote unquote, the lowest rank in the office up to the top. So you can see some of those differences here. And I'm not going to go into the differences that might exist between, Mark Master, which is very, very, very slim. Virtual Past Master is the formation of a craft lodge, minus the fact that American officers are also slightly different, not by much. And the Most Excellent Master's Lodge is not really relevant. That degree itself is much more like a play. But I hope that you can see this here, and I hope that it will draw some questions as we move forward. So some unique aspects about the working of the American Royal Arch, and I'm going to focus is very California heavy. The Royal Arch degree takes, at the bare minimum, for us to confer about 2 hours. I've seen it take longer. I've seen it take 2.5. I'm sure that there are some American companions even on this call that could tell me they've seen it take longer. 3 candidates are required to confer the Royal Arch, or in some certain cases, stand-ins are required. But usually this is a 3-candidate process where we bring in 3 candidates at one time. In English Royal Arch Masonry, and I should say that I'm familiar with English Royal Arch Masonry, and I've been brushing up even more lately, and it's an absolute beautiful, phenomenal ritual, and I really brushed up a bit recently just to make sure that I had my head on square about some of these really strong differences. One of the immediate ones is that the sojourn that is talked about briefly within English Royal Arch Masonry actually occurs in American Royal Arch Masonry. And this takes some time. This is a good portion of the beginning of the degree after the after an obligation is taken, and there's some more symbolic things that happen within American Royal Arch Masonry at the front that do not happen in English Royal Arch Masonry. It's made very well clear in American Royal Arch Masonry that you will humble yourself when entering the chapter, and we have an interesting way of showing that. Additionally, there are some callbacks to various teachings from the Old Testament early on in the degree, which then rolls into the obligation. And then we can talk about this sojourn. This takes place, and it takes quite a long time. And the principal sojourner in an American Royal Arch chapter is going to be one of the best ritualists you will ever meet. If you meet him, the vast amount of work that he has to memorize, and American Masonry requires strict adherence to memorization, and our degrees are quite long and quite large, very dramatic. The principal sojourner will be ultimately one of the best ritualists you ever meet because of the amount of work that he has to do as he takes this candidate on a physical sojourn. Many temples in America at one time possessed rivers in the floor of the chapter room or vaults built into the floor as well, because during the sojourn, certain things happen which involve crossing a river, crossing a bridge, and we can all imagine why a physical vault would have been important for certain aspects of this degree. I'm sure that idea is not, obviously lands well with you on why that would be important, but such things as a river still to this day fascinate me. And even with some of the earlier degrees conferred in a Royal Arch chapter in America previous to the Royal Arch, some are set up with some early pyrotechnic type of capabilities, which makes some of the degrees very interesting. As I was saying, passing the veils is an essential part of the American Royal Arch degree. It's very essential. It's very beautiful. I'm sure some of you have read the ceremony. I'm sure some have seen it. I've heard that in Bristol and in some areas in England that this is still worked within a Royal Arch chapter. I could be wrong, but I highly suggest if the opportunity ever presents itself that you certainly take part in being a spectator. What items are found? Now, this is one of those places where I'm going to kind of give this a bit of a wide berth. However, what I feel comfortable in saying is that in English Royal Arch Masonry, the focus is on a pedestal and something on the pedestal. In American Royal Arch Masonry, the pedestal is present, but it's not the main focus. There's an imitation of a very, 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 very famous chest or box. I'm sure you can imagine maybe what I'm talking about. And the items found therein and on this imitation are where we derive a lot of these aspects. And what is recovered, we all know what is recovered during the ceremony, regardless of how you get there. However, in American Royal Arch Masonry, it requires the usage of 3 other words in order to get to the prime purpose of what you recover and find within this beautiful degree. Some more unique aspects. So English Mark Master Masons and English Royal Arch Companions can visit an American chapter and attend either of those degrees, which they previously possess, but must be healed in the virtual past master if they are not a past master of a craft lodge or an installed master of a craft lodge. And they must be healed ultimately in the American Most Excellent Master degree if they wish to join an American chapter, visit an American chapter when it's working that degree, and or when they join to complete their journey to exaltation. Let's say that an English Mark Master moved to California and said, I really want to get active. We would bring him in. He's already received the mark, and then we would confer upon him the degrees that follow. So This is an interesting aspect of the American Royal Arch system. And I can assure you, healing is not a scary process. It involves a bit of a conversation, a bit of some promises, and then we move forward. So anyhow, each first principle of a chapter, which again is J, which is the high priest, they must receive or be anointed into the order of the high priesthood at the annual communication of Grand Chapter of California or by an authorized authority. Other principals and officers are installed in a very common manner. This is something different than English Royal Arch Masonry. I would just say that the chapter itself is installed in a manner akin to the, obviously focused on the Royal Arch, its symbolism, words, dialogues, implements, however, much more in a very common craft lodge type feel, with there not being a lot of private personal ceremony for the principals. Only the first principal would receive this type of privatized ceremony at our annual communication of Grand Chapter. And if any of you are members of the Allied Masonic degrees in England, you will be familiar with the Order of High Priesthood. I have it on very good, strong authority. Our version is just bigger and more blown out, but it is something very similar. And our first principals need to receive it. An additional thing, which I will obviously give somewhat of a wide berth also, is that every member of the chapter takes part in communicating the words or the name. Every single one. In addition, we also give, which I think is always very interesting, and it's a test of memory. Whenever we open or close a chapter, we go through all modes of recognition from the entered apprentice out to the Holy Royal Arch. Okay, so culture and customs. As with other American Masonic bodies, a chapter will ultimately operate in a manner suiting its specific membership instead of within unwritten social or cultural norms. To give you an example, you could have 5 lodges meeting in a building. One lodge is extremely formal, perhaps even tailcoats and white tie, proper festive board, et cetera, et cetera. Then you could have another body that comes and meets in jeans and polo shirts. In American Masonry, the master or the equivalent thereof determines what their body, what their unit is going to do based upon the direct culture of its membership. So in the metropolitan areas, you might find things extremely formal, buttoned up, and even, I would dare say, stuffy in some instances. But then when you go to the very rural areas, you could find the master of a lodge or chapter, et cetera, in a Stetson. His members are in the clothes they've come right from work because that suits the culture. So there's no unwritten social or cultural norms beyond those which are mandated by the grand body concerning certain protocols. In the state and elsewhere around the United States, chapters will sometimes band together for the purpose of helping each other confer the degrees. We tend to call these pilgrimages. Some chapters, when they have low membership, or perhaps the membership is getting to a point where working ritual is not their strongest suit, they will band together with other chapters to confer the degrees on the candidates of all the chapters in a certain locale at the same time. This practice also occasionally happens with Royal and Select Masters and the Knights Templar and Malta orders. The annual Grand Chapter communication is held at the same place at the same weekend as the Grand Communications for Royal and Select Masters and Knights Templar. And in California, I can tell you that we have the same Grand Secretary or equivalent thereto for all 3 bodies. It's the same man. The interconnection between the Grand Lodge and Grand Chapter does not mirror that of the United Grand Lodge of England and Supreme Grand Chapter. The Grand Lodge is supportive of all recognized Masonic bodies, but it does not intertwine so much as you might see in other grand jurisdictions. The chapter in America, especially in California, is the home of very serious ritualists and membership who appreciate the deeper aspects of Freemasonry. And most often, more often than not, those that are actively engaged in chapter are most likely also active within the other progressive orders. So now I'm going to show you some fun images of just some various pieces of regalia. So this would be a very common collar for an officer of a Royal Arch chapter. Chain collars are common amongst Masonic bodies in America. You do not have to be of the grand rank to possess one. Next to it is a display of the various jewels of the offices of an American Royal Arch chapter. And next to that is the jewel of the Order of the High Priesthood, which is something that it was presented to a chapter's high priest after he has been anointed into that order. I'm going to go ahead and move the slide. To the left, that is a very common apron of a member of a Royal Arch chapter in America. That is very standard. That is what your average member would have, not necessarily an officer and not a past high priest, past first principal. And to the right, that is an example of a Grand First Principles apron, past Grand First Principles apron. This is a beautiful custom California past first principles apron. And actually, I'm going to embarrass who is on this call. Excellent companion, Marty Cussing, a good friend of mine here, is on this call. This is an image of an apron that he had commissioned from Patrick Craddock, who owns the Craftsman apron here in America. This is something very special, and I had to include it. Some other examples of past first principles aprons. It is not always so uniformed across the board. Many past masters or the equivalent thereto in various orders will have custom aprons made for themselves, or perhaps their lodge, chapter, etc. has a standard design that they like to go with. But usually we try to maintain some symbolism, which then illustrates what rank the person is at, that being here of the image of the Order of the High Priesthood, part of the breastplate. And you see the keystone here included, which obviously alludes to the fact that the mark is also worked within the chapters. This right here is a very funny picture of myself and various companions on the day that I was installed as a first principal of my chapter, Siminoff Daylight chapter number 163, which meets at the Masonic Home in Union City. Usually we would not go in all this garb, and this garb it's 100 years old if it's a day old. And it barely fit me, barely fit some of the companions, but this was donated to us. And I said, you know what, no one's here, let's throw on the garb. The only thing that I'm missing is clearly the breastplate. And some of the other officers are missing other implements, which during our installation are given to them. But this was a very fun day with a lot of laughs and a lot of smiles, so I thought that I would include it. Okay, philanthropic endeavors. Every state Grand Chapter supports its own charities of choice. The Grand Chapter of California has the Fred DeBarrow and Gerald Woolforth Scholarship Fund. The General Grand Chapter itself has the Royal Arch Research Assistance, RARA, or RARA is a world-leading philanthropy for children with auditory processing disorders. We donate to a number of various causes that are helping alleviate and fight this. And every state Grand Chapter urges its membership to be active contributors to its Grand Lodge charities. So raising an arch for a future, where do we see Royal Arch Masonry going in California? New lodges are being formed. In the past decade, we've formed about, going to be coming up on about 45 to 50 new lodges, which for us is a big deal. That's more new lodges than we've seen formed in the state since the late 1950s. With the progression of new lodges will ultimately come the creation of new chapters. That is the next, obviously, regular step in a Masonic journey. And we see already talk from new lodges that eventually down the road, 5 to 6 years, they're looking to form chapters attached directly to the lodges. We promote the mark degree, which is part of the chapter via invitational programs, where we confer this, and then it helps develop further interest in joining chapter in the Holy Royal Arch itself. It's a wonderful initiative that any chapter is open to do. You can confer the mark on any Master Mason. The promise, or let's say agreement, would be that if they are going to then move forward into the Holy Royal Arch, they would join the chapter that promoted them to the mark. As people become more and more interested in Masonic education, in research, and in traditional Freemasonry, the chapter gains notice. The interest in the Royal Arch gains notice. And this year, especially with so many educational opportunities via Zoom, we've been able to explore a lot of Masonic history and symbolism, and the Royal Arch is a hotly talked about topic, especially here in the States. Additionally, we look forward to a perpetual exchange of ideas and connections in what has become a very small Masonic world based on social media, the usage of Zoom during this pandemic. We look forward to doing things exactly like we're doing today, which is being able to gather with companions from all over the world and share, talk, get to know each other, and set up plans, I hope, for some really strong opportunities for building together in the future. We're also looking to develop much stronger bonds between the Grand Lodge and Grand Chapter. And I'm not saying that as if there was a falling out, there never was. We're just looking for interesting ways to be able to engage Master Masons and Royal Arch companions together on a Grand Lodge level. And also, the Royal Arch, the chapter, is a wonderful place that offers true opportunities for young Masons to develop into young leaders and to eventually help make a difference. So in conclusion, regardless of jurisdictional differences, the spirit and purpose of the Royal Arch is universal. As new lodges are formed in the state of California, the chapter becomes the next ideal regular step of engagement and creation. And as I've said, it's a place where younger members are always most welcome to participate, which then helps them team up with those that are their senior to serve as mentors and help them build their knowledge and develop those skills, which will ultimately aid them in becoming great leaders and great servant leaders, especially to Freemasonry in the future. And with that, my companions, I thank you so much for listening to me present. My email address is down at the bottom of the screen in case you wish to contact me later. As you know, I am an Essex Mason as well. I'm always here to serve and join in with my province in any way that I can. So never hesitate to reach out to me. My line, my email, my Zoom is always open to you. And I look forward so much to the day when we can all safely travel again. And there's many great Masonic centers in England, in Essex, but I have to selfishly say that I can't wait to be able to be at Upminster again, to be at Southend again, and be able to partake in all of your fellowship. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and thank you so much.
Peter?
Yeah, sorry, just...
I noticed that there was silent applause. I don't know if it's possible to unmute everybody so that we can have some actual applause for that.
We'll definitely unmute everybody now. That was what I was struggling to find. Mute all open entry. I wasn't planned for that. You can all unmute yourselves now. If anyone wants to unmute themselves, and please feel free to clap.
Yes. Not so much a question as an observation. You say that in the American ritual, the word is shared at the opening and at the closing of the chapter. Although that's not a feature of Dramatic and Aldersgate, the commonest, there are certainly chapters in Derbyshire that I've been to where the word is shared as part of the closing, and I've certainly been to one in Weymouth, which has a charter that dates from before the Union, where they exchange the word as part of the opening ceremony. So you can see it in this country.
Thank you for sharing that, because that is something that interests me, and I should have stated, which I sometimes do more when I'm talking about the craft, but there's sort of this a fun assumption that certain things that are going on with an American ritual, oh, well, that must be an innovation, that must be something so new, because clearly Masonry did not come from America. However, what you find is that because the unionization did not affect us, we maintained a lot of things in Masonry that predate the Union, and that predate even in the craft emulation ritual or the standardization of rituals in general. I will say, without going too much into it, that what is shared at the opening of the chapter in America and what is shared at the end are not the same thing. And I'll just leave it there for now.
Okay, so we do have some other questions. Russ, I noticed that you had your hand up first. If you want to ask your question.
Yeah, hey Mike, great talk. That was very, very interesting, and I'm sure I speak for everyone that we were totally engaged with every single word that you said, and thank you very much. Very well presented. I have a question from a David Wilson, one of our Essex Masons. Whilst the use of a tracing board in the Royal Arch in the UK has gone out of fashion, are they still in use in the US? And to what form are they used, or do they take?
So there is no usage of a tracing board in the Royal Arch for us. Additionally, in American, I just will, because I can answer this so quickly, across the board, tracing boards are not a big aspect of American Masonry because our lectures are so long that if you tried to make a tracing board for one of our lectures, it would turn into what we possess. What was popular in the 1800s was the creation of these things called hieroglyphical charts. So they're not tracing boards, they're not a solid piece of art, but it's individual pieces of art which symbolize different aspects of the lecture or of the ritual themselves. So because of that, we rarely use those as well, but our ritual is very dramatic and experiential. So a lot of what might be explained in various tracing board lectures physically occurs to candidates in our various rituals. I hope that helps answer the question.
Good. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to take advantage of being able to not let anyone else get in front. You mentioned earlier around the steps between the journey from Mark Mason through to the companion. What sort of period is that? Is that at one meeting or is it over several meetings?
That depends. So if your chapter is going to confer the degrees upon you themselves, which is, common, it definitely won't happen in one meeting. You'll probably receive the mark and then maybe the virtual past master if there's time, but usually that would be 4 separate meetings at what I called a pilgrimage. Earlier, it would probably start at 8 a.m. in the morning. And by the time you've received all of the degrees, if you took them at a pilgrimage, it'd be time for the festive board in the evening by the time all of them have been conferred. So is it the most ideal way to receive them? It isn't at all. In my opinion. It's obviously more ideal that your chapter confers them slowly, one by one. However, as I was saying, with some chapters that are struggling, they team together to do this so that their candidates can experience these degrees and hopefully they can build and then reform and get the degrees back within the chapter.
You'd certainly be looking forward to the festive board, I'm sure, after all of those. Bruce Mapson is one of the assistants to the Provincial Grand Principals. Bruce, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, Mike, fascinating talk. Thanks for that, and lovely to see you again. And I hope it's not too long before you get back to Shoebury. Mike, 2 questions really, sort of joined together. So how often do your Royal Arch chapters meet in a year? How many meetings do they have? And you alluded earlier to the chapters, some being more formal than others. Do they all have a festive board of some fashion similar to we do after a meeting? Or are they more casual than that?
I'll answer both of those. And Bruce, it's good to see you. It's been quite a while.
Yeah.
Okay, so first question was, how often do chapters meet? Chapters in California need to meet at least once quarterly. Most chapters meet once a month. So at the bare minimum, they're holding one meeting once per month, but at that meeting, it's a business meeting. Not necessarily are the degrees being conferred. And that's the difference between American and English Masonry together. We're mandated to have these standing meetings, which is where the business of the lodge or chapter, et cetera, is conducted. How often are the degrees conferred? That would be something more that's seasonal. So I would say probably at most 3 to 4 times a year. Festive boards. Some lodges, some chapters will have them, others won't. Some will be much more casual. It might be more of a potluck scenario after the meeting or something where it's much more casual. Or even some where the membership is older might have their meal prior because we meet in the evening hours. So they want to be able to eat, share in some fellowship. After the meeting, they might stay around for, or go out together and have some drinks, but it's not a guarantee. So it's really lodge per lodge, chapter per chapter, et cetera.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Just before we go on to Brian, Randall is next. Any companion that wishes to ask a question, at the bottom of your screen there is a reaction section, and in there you can raise your hand. So if you wish to ask a question, please feel free. Brian Randall, over to you. Hold on, let me unmute you again. That's it.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. Mike, that was a fantastic presentation. I really appreciated that. You mentioned that the word is spoken at the beginning of the meeting and also at the end. How does that work if you're working the mark degree on a candidate as a one-off? Like, would that mark degree candidate be there for the whole ceremony to the end of the ceremony, or is he put out? And the same thing for those other intermediate degrees before taking the Holy Royal Arch.
That is an incredible question. Thank you for asking that, because that's something that I should have touched on. So what would happen, this is how it operates. The chapter is opened with Royal Arch Masons only present. The chapter then calls down to a lodge of Mark Master Masons, Lodge of Virtual Past Masters, or Most Excellent Masters. At that time, anyone who can be brought into the room will be. So that would be the time when the mark is conferred upon a new initiate, as it were. So they would not be there for that part of the opening. They would be there for that degree specifically. We do have an opening and closing for the mark, but it's very, very rarely used, because generally speaking, there's more happening that day beyond just the mark degree. And the way our, let's just say, laws operate is that if we're going to conduct business, it has to be on the degree of Royal Arch. So we have to open on that degree and close on that degree, but we can call down as needed to confer other degrees. Hope that helps answer the question.
Okay, thank you. The next question, sir, is for me. Nick.
Thank you, Peter. Mike, absolutely fascinating presentation. Raised so many questions. We could be here all night if we were to ask them all. But you did mention, I think, a chapter, I think it was called a past high priests chapter that didn't convene, that captured companions that didn't have another membership. I was just a bit, I was interested to know a bit more about that. Is it a device just to stop people dropping out of the Royal Arch altogether?
Yeah, that's a fair way of putting it. That exists for us in the craft as well. The Grand Master's Lodge, which is for those unattached brothers, the Grand High Priest chapters for unattached companions. And this all has to do with how various jurisdictions deal with unattached brothers or companions, which differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. In ours, we try to keep them active so that when they join, there's an easier process to it. However, there's rules around how often you can join, who you can go visit, and then when you eventually need to pick where you're going to go and then join and move forward out of that holding chapter. So really it is, like you're saying, it's more of a device that's kept to keep them in the fold as a regular, up-to-date, paid subscribing member of a chapter. But we hope that they obviously go out and then find themselves a chapter that convenes and carry on that way.
And is there a limit to how long they can remain a member of that chapter?
You know, off the top of my head, I don't have the number for the Grand High Priest chapter, but for Grand Lodge, rule of thumb is 365 days. That's what we try to promote anyway, so that no one can be in there for more than a year. We want them to go out and then find a new chapter to join that they can be a part of.
Thank you, Mike.
Mm-hmm.
There are no further hands up. If anyone does want to ask a question and not sure how to raise their hand, I have now enabled unmute yourself. So feel free to unmute yourself. Okay.
Hi, it's Bob Norris from West Lancashire. Excellent presentation, Michael. Thank you very much for that. And thank you, Essex, for the invite to us lockdown Northerners. I just noticed that a lot of the degrees that you were talking about, we would call over here Royal and Select. If you'd taken those degrees, would you then be allowed to participate fully in a Californian Royal Arch meeting, or would you still have to do these various affiliations?
As far as the degree is, how can I put it? It doesn't have to be word perfectly the same, but if you say, well, I received them in Royal and Select Masters, great, you received them. There's no reason to be healed. That's not that to us is not the big part. It's simply, have you not received this? Okay, then we need to heal you. But if you've received it, because for an example, in Australia, they operate somewhat in a similar way in some areas, some jurisdictions, as to how we operate. Someone might say, well, my Royal Arch chapter has a warrant that permits us to work Knight Mason degrees also. So I've received those. Can I join a Knight Masons Council when I come to the States? And ultimately the answer would be yes. So it's not where you receive them, as long as you regularly receive them, there's some form of recognition, acceptance, you're good to go. Hope that answers that.
It does. I'm a member of the Scottish Royal Arch as well, so past the veils, my chapter call it the Excellent Master's degree, which again crosses over to Royal and Select. But yeah, that answers it. Thank you very much indeed.
Say that at the start of the meeting they repeat the words. Did I see on the written part of it that it's the password for every degree from entered apprentice upwards?
We would not actually demand the word. Well, that's a difference also between American and English Freemasonry. So, for an example, and I have to say this in order for it all to make sense, but let's say that you're going to be passed to the Fellowcraft degree. One of the big differences is that we do not offer the password to be admitted into a Fellowcraft's lodge prior to the passing. All modes of recognition words are received after, well, they're learned, but they're formally received after the obligation has been taken. With that being the case, we do not demand words, but what we do is that we do the signs from entered apprentice all the way up to the Holy Royal Arch when opening and closing a chapter.
Thank you.
Yep.
Are there any more questions? Okay, if there are no further questions, I'd like to hand back to the Deputy Grand Superintendent in charge, excellent companion Nick Franklin, to close off.
Excellent companion Mike, once again on behalf of all the companions, I'd like to thank you for a thoroughly captivating presentation, which was expertly delivered, and I'm sure we're all a lot more informed about the Royal Arch in America. I'm sure this could have gone on much longer, because I'm sure many of us had many other questions to ask, and perhaps we'll invite you back on some future occasion if you're willing. But as a token of our gratitude for you sparing the time for us this evening, or in your case this morning, we decided that we'd make a donation to charity, or we'd make a donation to a charity of your choice in the sum of £250. Now, I know that Elliot may have mentioned something to you, and I don't think you've nominated a charity as such, but in the absence of a charity, you may correct me in a moment, but we would propose to make a donation to the festival in your name.
Thank you, sir. That would be my choice as well. Thank you so much for the kind offer. That would certainly be where I'd like to see it go.
Fantastic, and thank you for your generosity. But and from a personal perspective, I do have extended family in California, so at some stage in the future, I'm probably going to have occasion to visit them, and maybe we'll have the opportunity to experience the American or the Californian Royal Arch at first hand, and maybe I'll come to you for an introduction.
Well, you're in trouble now, because I'm gonna you're gonna have more meetings than you know what to do with. Absolutely, you are always welcome. You're welcome at my chapter, Siminoff Daylight chapter, my lodge, Templum Rose number 863, and any Masonic orders that we share. You are always a welcome guest here. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that, and once again, thank you on behalf of the companions for a fascinating presentation. And I think I would also like to thank Peter Lowe and his team for hosting this meeting. Well done, chaps. And thank you all companions for being here and to listen to to Mike talk this evening. We hope in the future to have other provincial speaker series presentations, and we're looking at another headline speaker in the very near future. But in the meantime, that other contributions we've made and during the lockdown period, such as the video nuggets that myself and other members of the Royal Arch Executive recorded, are still available to be viewed on the Cube website if you're interested. But do watch this space. I think the future editions of the Provincial Speaker Series will be advertised via the normal channels, and Elliot will make sure that they go out via social media and the Second Rising and so forth. But I think apart from that, companions, thank you once again for being here. I do hope you enjoy what's remains of your weekend. For us in England, it's just Sunday evening. You've got rather longer, Mike, but and I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, everybody. The recording of this will be on Essex Freemasons YouTube channel. Thank you, brethren and companions.